an investor's perspective on the shareholder proposal process. And when I say an investor's perspective, I mean an investor's perspective, because Tim Smith has been working on shareholder proposals for over 5 decades. He's back working as a senior policy advisor for ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. He's done an amazing job over the years navigating a much changed shareholder proposal process over his career. Today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. Tim, so you're a legend. Not many of the young people might have heard of your name lately, but for me, who has been involved in the shareholder proposal process for pretty long myself, you go even further back. So at this point, you might actually be the longest serving person that's still in the area. How did you get involved with shareholder proposals in the first place?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's a bit of ancient history, isn't it? Way back in 1971, so over 50 years ago, the Episcopal Church made history by filing a shareholder resolution with General Motors on the issue of apartheid in South Africa. And while there had been individuals filing resolutions on governance reforms back in the 50s and earlier, perhaps, this was the first concerted set of resolutions led by religious groups, in this case, on a social issue. This was apartheid in South Africa. So actually, because it was an unusual kind of intervention, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church went to the stockholders meeting of General Motors and spoke and made his appeal. The vote was infinitesimal. I think it was about 3%. But it was a front page story in the New York Times because it was very meaningful for these issues to be being raised by investors with companies. And it grew from there. Brock, one of the fascinating things to watch is the number of proponents who's growing, not just religious groups or individuals, but now pension funds, trade unions, foundations, state and city funds, who are active voices using their voice and vote with companies to encourage them to be more transparent or more accountable on social and environmental issues. So it's been a fascinating thing to watch over the last 50 plus years. And the number of issues, of course, is growing considerably too, dozens and dozens of issues being raised through the engagement in the shareholder resolution process. And important to state that when I use the word engagement, I mean an investor or investors, a group working together might engage a company and ask for a conversation on an issue or present a position that they'd like to discuss. And the company often comes forward and there's a meaningful discussion. We learn from each other and there's an agreement reached. So those engagements may never go to become a shareholder resolution. But in addition, there are resolutions sponsored to get the attention of top management and the board. And in a considerable number of those cases, those resolutions result in meaningful dialogue that results in the withdrawal of the resolution and a win-win agreement, if we call it that.
And you've, for a large part of your career, you've had, if I understand correctly, you have had really 2 different jobs. You had Walden Asset Management, and then, of course, the Interfaith. And then that would be 2 different ways you have been involved.
Yeah, similar approaches. From 1971 to 2000, I worked with the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. I served as their executive director for much of that time. And so we were leading and coordinating work, not just of faith-based investors, because ICCR had other investors who would join as affiliates too. But then in 2000, I left and joined what's now called Boston Trust Walden, which is an investment firm based in Boston that focuses on ESG investing and manages about $14 billion for clients. So I was the director of shareholder engagement there. So we're still involved in many of the same issues I was in ICCR, but wearing a different hat, working for an investment firm. And I retired from that post in December. And thank goodness ICCR reached out, and I'm now a senior policy advisor with ICCR, working on some of the same issues, coincidentally.
So with these groups, it's interesting because you have to navigate different groups. How does the group decide which topics to tackle year to year in a shareholder proposal?
Well, I'm also on the board of the pension board of the United Methodist Church. It's called WestPath. And when decisions are being made about priorities, I think whether it's WestPath or a coalition like ICCR or an investment firm like Boston Trust Walden, we're obviously looking at the issues that matter and that are material and important. We are reading the papers to see if a scandal jumps out at us with a given company who's got some problems that we are investors with the company and want to address. And we look at who else is doing the work. So it may be that an issue is important, but it's being addressed fully by other organizations or even by the government or the company itself. And we would be more of a passive observer than an actively engaged share owner at that point.
Can you speak to the recent attacks on ESG, which have really escalated over the last year or so?
They have escalated. You're absolutely right. It's quite amazing to watch because I've never seen this kind of well-funded, coordinated, broad-based kind of effort to discredit not just ESG investing, but discredit shareholder proponents and the shareholder resolution process, and even the issues that companies are also embracing, issues like climate change and diversity. So these attacks against what they describe as woke capitalism isn't just about the investment world. It's also about companies who embrace sustainability and work on climate and diversity and human rights. So all of that, according to the right-wing critics, is considered to be woke and inappropriate, and just an example of, they describe it strangely as caving into left-wing pressure following a leftist agenda. So the expansion of these attacks has multiple faces, which is also interesting to see. There's legislation at the federal level, and you may know that July was ESG month in the House, as the House committees dealt with hearings on ESG investing and had serious criticisms being raised by various speakers. And Democrats, of course, had one speaker to carry water for them. And then, of course, what we've been watching at the state level as well over 30 states have had legislation put on the docket to restrict or really dismantle aspects of ESG investing. I think it's about a dozen states have had certain resolutions passed or policies in place. And then beyond that, there's also legal challenges. So, for example, court suits, and recently the National Association of Manufacturers joined in a legal action as an amicus filer, trying to limit the role of the SEC in adjudicating the shareholder resolution process. So taking away some of the powers of the SEC, strangely arguing that the SEC did not have the authority to do this. So try to limit their authority greatly. So I know Ceres and ICCR joined together and sent out a letter challenging the fact that NAM was making these claims and asking the public to understand that this was indeed part of the SEC's role. So we have legislative action, legal action, challenges against companies, as I mentioned before. So that's challenges against companies embracing sustainability. Lots of PR criticizing both proponents and the issues. and a real attempt now to change the SEC rules, not just the NAM court case, but to try, as you've seen perhaps in the federal legislation that's being proposed or the hearings raised, attempts to undercut the proxy voting agencies, Glass, Lewis, and ISS, but also to cast great doubt on the integrity of the process, the proxy and shareholder resolution process, and to challenge the proponents as, again, somehow carrying a left-wing agenda. The great irony here is that, of course, many of these issues are issues that are clearly material for companies. It's not a political agenda. It's a common sense investment and business agenda. And that's why you have companies by the thousands addressing climate change themselves. They didn't need investors who were, quotes, left-wing activists and, to quotes, pressuring them. They understood the risk for themselves and the risks to the environment, the risk to the economy, and the risk to portfolios as well. So the very fact that an issue like climate change is not just an issue investors or environmentalists are raising, but companies and government also are addressing it vigorously as well, and global, not just in the
United States. All stakeholders, communities. I mean, things are changing.
Yes,
have changed.
But these attacks are serious.
Yeah.
They've not borne great fruit at the state level. As I said, about a dozen states did pass some legislation. And part of the attacks are attacks on the large investment managers. You've seen them: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, etc. And BlackRock saw states like Oklahoma and Texas and Florida withdraw, I think, over $4 billion in investment accounts from them, arguing again they were diverting attention from shareholder interests to focus on a political agenda. The irony is, of course, that in Europe and in many parts of the United States, it's clearly understood that these issues like climate are material and vitally important to address. And so at the same time, BlackRock did lose some accounts. They also brought in, I think Larry Fink said, $200 billion worth of accounts. So that's interesting. But this is the first time, I think, Brock, we've seen serious actions, economic actions by investment asset owners against managers like this.
So how has the negotiation process with companies over shareholder proposals changed, would you say, over, let's say, the last 5 years?
That's an interesting question. It's very hard to generalize because some companies treat the resolution process as a very hostile act. Their instinct is to just push back, fight back. But many, many, many companies see it as an opportunity to engage their owners. After all, they are stockholders. They have long-term capital at risk, and to share as management, share what they're doing in the field, learn some things from the investors about what increasing best practices might be understood to be. And as I said a few minutes earlier, in many of these cases where a resolution actually gets filed, I think about a third of them are withdrawn because of agreements. And sometimes, interestingly enough, even though an agreement isn't reached, there's a civil discourse, which I think the shareholder resolution process invites. Not a boycott, not a divestment action, not hostile takeover attempts, but a civil discourse. And companies do sometimes change later. In other words, they may politely disagree and say, we're going to put the resolution on the proxy, we'll have a vote, but we do not, at this point, we're not going to agree with the sponsor. But 5 or 10 years even later, a company might say, well, the situation's changed. Our competitors are acting differently. The various stakeholders or publics we deal with, their expectations have changed, and we'll be glad to make the specific change you asked for. So that's interesting to watch as well. That it is not just you have to be a long distance runner. It's not just a magic bullet where you engage a company or file a resolution and within 6 months you've got an agreement. It may be a long-term engagement and a meaningful one too.
Yeah, that's what I hear, that in some cases a company might not be able to make the change that a proponent wants in a single year. It might take them 2 years. And so that's one reason why the proponent might withdraw the proposal and see the progress that the company has promised that they'll make in year one, and
A wait and see approach. That's right. Here's an interesting example. For 20 years, investors have been petitioning Home Depot to disclose more information on diversity, including their EEO-1 report, the statistics about where people of color, women are on the job ladder. And the company, again, wasn't like hostile, but just said, no, we won't do that. Our lawyers have advised against it. Well, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because the tragedy of George Floyd's death created a larger public debate, didn't it, about racial justice and about violence on people of color. And New York City joined in the resolution I guess it was 2-3 years ago, asking the same request that we've had for 20 years, along with some Roman Catholic orders who'd been faithfully involved in this action. And as Home Depot understood the context had changed, the lawyer's opinion may have still had some merit, but it wasn't outweighing the terrible reputational risk of opposing providing basic information on diversity. So the company stepped up, made an offer to do so, and the resolution was withdrawn. And when New York City filed, I'm remembering correctly, over 60 such resolutions, I think they had 95% agreement with the companies who said, time has come, we'll make the disclosure request.
Yeah, amazing how fast things can change. And sometimes it just takes one moment of public consciousness to affect change.
Well said. And on issues like climate change, likewise, as we all read the fairly grim headlines that come out of the IPCC, but also media stories that we read every day, we know that this is a very serious threat to our economy, our companies, our portfolios. And I think that companies want to find meaningful middle ground with investors on that issue too. So it's an issue where we're seldom finding companies who say this is irrelevant, it's not important to us, we're not going to take action.
So what are the biggest mistakes that you see companies make when they first receive a proposal from you?
Maybe one of the errors would be that a company might see that immediately as sort of a hostile action against the company, and that it becomes something that's led by the lawyers then who are going to respond. I think on most occasions, ICCR members, before they file a resolution, write letters or try to have a dialogue with the company. But there are some major investors who basically file first and then open up the engagement. So I think I remember Peggy Foran, now the corporate secretary at Prudential, formerly at Pfizer, would say, take these interventions seriously, talk to the proponents. You might find some of them are absolutely zany and incapable of having a rational discussion. Okay, you understand that. There are such resolutions these days because the far right is filing resolutions arguing that we should have diversity initiatives because white men are being discriminated against. But Peggy Foran would always counsel, talk to the proponents, learn from each other, see what their motives and what they're really looking for are, and see if you can find a meaningful common ground. So I think an error would be to treat a proponent as a hostile advocate. It's not like trying to take over the company, right? It's basically trying to put a position before the company on political spending or lobbying or human rights or environmental issues, plastic prevention, plastic pollution prevention. So I think the proponents also have some things to learn. I think it is important for the investor community to let companies know that they are going to engage them, but that isn't something that should be seen as a hostile intervention. And they should. My own belief is it's a wiser course and a fairer course to engage a company first before you file a resolution. Just don't slap a resolution down on the table. Having said that, sometimes a deadline pops up on you. The company has an early filing deadline, and you have to work to get something into the company early on. In those cases, we often in the filing letter would explain we're doing this to meet a legal deadline, but we're glad to talk and work something out.
And I would just mention, as a longtime observer, because shareholder proposals have now been taken seriously by most companies for at least a dozen years, the directors on many of these boards will also sit usually on multiple boards. They're accustomed to receiving shareholder proposals and that they're taken seriously. So if you're the corporate secretary and you're not for some reason taking it seriously, you're going to find that a number of your directors probably have a different opinion about that.
That's absolutely right. And it's also interesting that the votes on these resolutions from the early years when it was unknown territory, you're lucky to get a 5% vote. And now you regularly see some companies get votes over 50% or 40 to 50%. And this year has been a year where there's been a decline in the votes. Some people having the opinion that this is part of the anti-ESG attacks that are going on, because BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street did not vote very vigorously this year on environmental issues or diversity issues. But nonetheless, many of these resolutions still got decent votes, 25 to 40%. So that's saying that investors care about these issues, and it's wise for a company to pay attention to them and engage.
So can you tell us about the SGI conference coming up on September 12th that will celebrate 50 years of service to the people and the planet?
So the seventh generation coalition based in Milwaukee, but with a multi-state membership, is celebrating 5 decades of work in this space. I can remember when they first started, when a priest named Michael Crosby, who is a real champion of this work, not just in addressing companies from tobacco companies to Exxon, but also trying to encourage the religious community to pay attention to the fact that they had a tool to be able to use as an investor and had a responsibility as an investor too. So in the mid-70s, Mike was involved in actually helping or the early 70s, pull together these coalitions of, in this case, it was initially Roman Catholic orders, and they joined ICCR as a coalition, so thus broadening the base of ICCR, which started off as a group of Protestant denominations, and got involved in many of the issues we're talking about, environment, and later on, climate change, diversity, other human rights concerns. And Mike himself was a great champion of raising with the tobacco industry what the impact of their products were on not just youth, but on people's health. And he stuck to that before he died several years ago. So this is a celebration, but also we hope an opportunity to stop and reflect about, well, the challenges we face going forward. So I have the opportunity to provide a keynote address, and I will try to both give thanks and celebrate for 5 decades of leadership here, but say indeed we need to double down for another round of significant advocacy, because this work is under attack. Every single piece of work that ICCR and seventh generation works on is now being criticized as somehow being leftist, a leftist agenda rather than common sense corporate responsibility.
Tim, I can't thank you enough for 5 decades of dedication to really working on behalf of all of us. And it's people like you that I have always admired so much, because you've taught me, you've taught so many, and we're all better off for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.